This week on Just Solutions, the legacy of the Wilmington coup and massacre. In 1898, white supremacists overthrew a local government in North Carolina. What lessons have we learned from that history, and what parallels can we draw with today? How do the insurrectionists of January 6th, 2021 compare with those in Wilmington 1898? Today's guests are both from Wilmington, Reggie Shuford and Greg Lindquist. We'll discuss why the massacre has not been taught in the curriculum of American public schools. Why has it been omitted from the dominant historical narratives of American history? The legacy of the Wilmington coup and massacre and hidden histories. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Well, Greg and Reggie, it's great to have you with us. And just to give our viewers a little bit more background, you are both from Wilmington, and we're going to talk about your personal experience growing up, but you're both involved in social justice issues. Greg is a New York-based artist and writer, and a lot of your work converges around social justice themes. And Reggie Shuford is an activist and lawyer in Philadelphia, also originally from Wilmington, but he's also the vice chair of the board of directors of Free Speech TV. So we're delighted to have you both here. This is a second conversation we're having around Wilmington because there's so much to dig into. And what we're going to do is talk about the legacy of Wilmington and how that has impacted and continues to impact people growing up there. And the fact that, as we heard, it's not being taught in public schools. We'll get into this in a moment, how there's a real strong effort to erase and whitewash history right now in public schools. But Reggie, we'll start with you first. When you were growing up in Wilmington, what did you know about the events of 1898? When did you first become aware of them?
Well, first of all, Maeve, it's a delight to be here with you today, so thanks for having me. So while growing up in Wilmington, I knew absolutely nothing about the events of 1898. And in fact, I didn't learn about those events until I was an adult living and working in New York City. So I'd say I learned about them maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but not even really. I guess I heard about them at that point, but didn't really learn about them until just over a year ago, with the publication of a book called Wilmington Lies. And so I learned a lot more details about what had happened and was, I guess, shocked and angry, frankly, that I hadn't been taught that stuff while growing up and living in Wilmington.
Greg, what was your experience growing up in Wilmington? Was this a history that you were aware of? When did you become aware of the events of 1898?
Absolutely not. And, you know, I was thinking about this in preparing for this talk. And I grew up working middle class. Both of my parents were professors. And I also was part of like the kind of counterculture of punk and skateboarding. And it never came up in those groups, these groups were always inclusive and digging around histories, a lot of things with social justice and animal rights. And I never knew about it. And I never knew about it until like 6-7 years ago. So I think, you know, Reggie and I did these series of reading groups, starting with Wilmington's Lies. And we found kind of similar experiences with people that joined the groups who lived in Wilmington their entire lives and didn't know anything about this. And it's something that kind of sits under the surface. And even though we didn't know about it, we felt its presence. And I think Reggie's talked about this a little bit as well.
Well, how did you both then connect? Just from you describing your background, Greg, I would imagine that maybe in your youth, you were potentially in different circles. So how did you both connect, and what role did learning about the events of 1898 play in that connection?
Well, I think, so Greg and I'm a little older than he is, so we were growing up at slightly different times. But I just want to underscore something he said, and then I'll answer more directly your question. It was always beneath the surface, even though it was never discussed or talked about. Its presence and legacy were deeply, deeply felt. And it remains that way. I mean, in terms of limited opportunity for Black people, especially in terms of fraught relationships between the Black community and police, in terms of residential segregation, um, and you know, some of those things are very present today. Greg and I met because we both happen to be affiliated with a nonprofit organization headquartered in Wilmington called Working Film. So Greg was was commissioned to do some artwork around um, some work that Working Films was doing, and I was, I think, chair of the board at the time. And so we were in Wilmington um, at the same time while he was working. I was at the board meeting, and so we met and just struck up a conversation. And ironically, it was either both of us had experienced run-ins with the police, either that very day or certainly within that same weekend. And so we shared our stories, we clicked, a friendship developed, and we kept in touch. We talked about wanting to collaborate if we could find a way to do that. And so the formation of our book club, the 1898 Reading Group, is one of the things that has allowed us to collaborate.
Reggie, you said that you were quite angry when you discovered the history that you had not been taught growing up in Wilmington. So let's dig into why it's not been taught. I mentioned at the top of the show that there's a concerted effort right now to whitewash history. This is nothing new, obviously, but right now there are at least 15 state houses around the country that are trying to pass or have already passed legislation that would block critical discussions on race in public schools. States including North Carolina and Oklahoma, which is this year commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre there as well. Talk a little bit about how it has not just been ignored in the history books, but actively suppressed. And what are some of the dynamics, particularly in Wilmington, that have led to this not being something that folks like yourselves, who were grown up in Wilmington, have become aware of? And you had to basically educate yourselves when you became adults.
Yeah, I think it was very intentional. I consider a conspiracy of silence, and that conspiracy of silence allows the victors, right, to create the narrative and to control it. And I think they used it. And I think historically they have, in these situations, used the narrative that they've created to justify the violent ends to which they've gone to oppress Black people. And also controlling the narrative, they lie about what really happened. They lie about the motivation behind the violence. They lie about the motivation behind the massacre. And in this instance, they said that they lied and said that Black people were planning a massacre, that Black men were raping white women, that Black people were going to take over the city of Wilmington, and so on and so forth. And so they told those lies as a way to justify their violence and the massacre itself. And they didn't really want anybody to know about it. They didn't want anybody to question that narrative. And so if you don't teach about it, then very few people can raise questions about it. My anger was in part because, as Greg and I have both mentioned, we felt it in the environment around us, yet we couldn't name it. And then when we learned about it, we were able to put a name and an explanation to it. And it wasn't limited to 1898. The same thing continues to happen as we speak. The less you know, the more you can object, and the less opportunity you have to demand change and equality and justice for everybody. So you create the narrative, you control the narrative, you lie about the narrative, and you keep people in the dark about what really happened. And as a way, you continue to control the narrative and make sure that your power, right, is kept intact.
Well, last week we spoke with filmmaker Chris Everett, who's behind the documentary Wilmington on Fire, that we are very proud to be having the Free Speech TV broadcast premiere happening this week, which really digs into a lot of this history. And we also spoke with historian Lorraine Umfleet, who's featured in that documentary, and she talked about the erasure of this story as well. And I would like to talk to you, Reggie, a little bit more about the trauma that erasure then contributes, because there's so much trauma that happened to the Black community. As we heard in last week's show, it was a thriving middle-class Black community. There really was, in many ways, it was not a utopia, but there was a lot more equality, certainly than in other cities at that time. And it has never recovered. It's never recovered the Black population in terms of those who were murdered or forced to flee, and certainly the economic impact on the Black community. So when you have the very real trauma of what happened in the coup and massacre, but then you have the trauma of silence, Reggie, what does that do to you, say, growing up and knowing that this has been omitted?
Yes, it feels like the original case of gaslighting, to be perfectly honest. Like, you know, all of these things are happening, you just don't know why. And I feel to this day that so many Black families lost so much, including their identity, their property, the opportunities for intergenerational wealth and economic well-being, and so on and so forth. I felt like the part that made me the most angry was, I felt like, number one, so many of our families were denied the opportunity to thrive, like economically and socially, and not only was the Black community traumatized in that way, so too were white allies, but also the town itself. Like, the town itself never recovered. Certainly the Black community never recovered. And I think it wasn't until the 1970s that a Black person was elected to a citywide political office after 1898. And so, in a sense, Wilmington has continued to lag behind. And all the problems with the lack of value on Black lives, and economic deprivation, and residential segregation, like those things continue. Lots of people are doing activism around it now, but they really continue. And so not only were Black families in the Black community harmed and traumatized, but the city itself never recovered. And as a result, there remains some degree of racial hostility still, but certainly the reputation that Wilmington is hostile to Black people. And because most of my family lives there, and because I've experienced some of that hostility myself when I visited, the lack of the erasure of that history denies the real opportunity for conversation around that history. And if you can't talk about it, then you can't fix it. And so these issues continue to persist.
There's also silence, I think, amongst the descendants, and we hear about that in the documentary Wilmington on Fire. Because of that trauma, it was such a painful thing for those who survived the massacre. So you had the folks, obviously, who were murdered, but then there were many folks who were banished. And in the book that you formed a book club around, Wilmington's Lie, there's a very moving passage from Dr. Lewin Manley, who's the grandson of the owner of the Black-owned newspaper in Wilmington that was torched deliberately as part of the events of the massacre and the coup in 1898. And he says that the stress from what they saw, they never got over it. It scared the hell out of them, and that's why they never talked about it. So there was all of this trauma that led to silence amongst
Absolutely.
the descendants themselves. And we've heard that from the descendants of survivors of the Greenwood massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And we've talked a lot about that intergenerational trauma. That is a very, very real thing. Reggie, do you have any thoughts on how we need to move forward on that? Because that trauma is never necessarily discussed. We sometimes talk about the economic realities and that legacy, but the mental health and the trauma issues that are facing folks as a result of this, it's a huge issue too.
Absolutely. And so people have said to me when we talk about the conspiracy of silence, they've said, well, what about like Black people talking about what happened? And the reality, I think, is that people were continued to be terrified. Talking about intergenerational trauma, that fear also was passed down. Like they remember what happened to their ancestors. And then growing up in Wilmington, I often heard you need to not talk about this stuff. Don't say anything. Don't stir up trouble. Don't walk in that neighborhood after dark. So there's still fear that what happened in 1898 could repeat itself. The violence could happen again. And I think that we will never get beyond that until we have meaningful truth and reconciliation in Wilmington and in the entire country. And I think it has to happen in that order. We have to have truth first, to acknowledge what really happened, all of the facts, not alternative facts, but the real facts. We have to talk about that stuff, and then we have to figure out how to reconcile that history in order that it, number one, not be repeated, but number two, not continue to have such a profound impact on the town itself and all of its residents.
Well, Greg, what was your experience then growing up in a very different community as a white person in Wilmington? And, we've already discussed the fact that you weren't being taught about this. You found out about this when you were an adult and did your own research. But what are your thoughts about the legacy and the broader Wilmington community of the omission of this from history?
Yeah, I mean, as Reggie mentioned, we had very different experiences running in with police in Wilmington in, what was that, 2014. And I experienced white privilege, and I didn't even understand it until I moved away from Wilmington. And I began to self-interrogate and ask myself, what is my experience? What is my obligation, or what is my moral obligation for my experience? And part of it is using my privilege to make art that calls attention to these social problems. But I think I'd like to back up a little bit and just talk a little bit about like why this history isn't being taught, like what are some of the mechanisms behind that? Because one of the things that we got in when we were preparing for this 1898 billboard and signs that we put up as a get out to vote effort, I started digging around the histories, and there's one thing that's really evident is that there were a lot of organizations that were made during Reconstruction to write these histories. And one of the major ones is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization that was formed like mid 1890s and lobbied textbook companies, which are largely based in Texas. And, they also put up these statues with Confederate soldiers selling the mythology of the hero. This has been another flashpoint and lightning point of controversy in Wilmington, because they were temporarily removed about a year ago, and that wasn't really clear. They did it under obscure ordinance to be removed to protect them. But I mean, just to circle back, I mean, I've had conversations with people who still live in Wilmington, and someone who's aware of the conversations on the Board of Education. And one of the things that comes up again and again is pushing to implement this into the curriculum. And one of the conversations, I think in the last year, the pushback was, why do people keep wanting to talk about this? It just makes it worse. And I think the key question is there, worse for whom? Because as Reggie said, the only way that we're going to change this behavior is to examine our past.
That idea of not talking about this, it ties so much into not just how history is taught, but just how we even use language. Because for so long, what happened in Wilmington and in Tulsa, there are so many parallels. They were misdescribed. And even in many reports now, you will see them being described as riots, as if there was some sort of equal nature on both sides. It was not a riot, it was a massacre, and people were murdered. This idea of how language has been deployed as a weapon, as a tool for white supremacy, when we're looking at history being whitewashed.
Absolutely, and I think Greg and I talked about it a lot. We've written a piece about this, and we have a section called "Language Language Matters," right? Because even we struggled with the right language, like we didn't know, right? Was it a riot? I mean, what was it, right? And as I said before, the victor controls the narrative, and it's very, very intentional, the language they use to justify their violent behavior. And in the Wilmington massacre of 1898, a prominent mechanism that was used to allow this thing to take place, because number one, it wasn't subtle, it was taking place quite publicly, right? Was the use of the newspaper, the Wilmington News and Observer. And so obviously it was using language that was inflammatory. It was spreading lies about Black men and white women, and that Black people were trying to, control. They were gonna, just as Wilmington was led by a biracial fusion government, that Wilmington folks were seeking to expand that control over white people, and so it was the use of particular words and terminology and language, but also the mechanisms like newspapers, right, and drawings and cartoons that allowed them also to further their ends.
Well, I'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching us from. And is this something you've been taught in schools? Is this something you're just learning about, maybe on Free Speech TV or through other books or the documentaries? We're so pleased to be able to dig into some of this history that's not just being ignored, but being actively suppressed. And we definitely encourage our viewers to engage with Wilmington on Fire, the documentary that's having its Free Speech TV premiere this week, because it really is so enlightening on all of these issues. But there was some discussion around Wilmington in mainstream press that maybe would not have otherwise talked about it in the aftermath of January 6th, because Wilmington in 1898 was the first and only actual coup of an elected government that has happened on US soil. There was a lot of discussion in the aftermath of January 6th and parallels being drawn between a white supremacist mob attempting another coup. What were your thoughts on that, Greg and Reggie, when you saw the events of January 6th playing out, particularly in the, you'd been doing many years of work and research into the legacy of Wilmington at that stage?
I mean, I think immediately we began communicating about the parallels, and then that drove us to write a statement connecting these events. And I mean, we have all the blueprints in Wilmington. We have the refusal to accept the outcome of a fair election, the launch of a disinformation campaign based on lies to subvert an election, the brutal and violent suppression of the Black vote, racist policing and brutalization. What we saw here in 1898 was actually Union soldiers placing Confederate generals as the head of and members of the Wilmington police force. And you have, so I mean, we were very much thinking about this and figuring out how we could write a statement that called attention to this.
Yeah, and I would add, Greg is exactly right. And so what we weren't was surprised by it. And in fact, I think we named our piece that we wrote, we named it Passing the White Supremacy Baton, November 10, 1898 to January 6, 2021, because the parallels were so very, very, very clear to us. And again, it goes back to history and what is taught. So while Greg and I knew that history, because we've been studying the events of 1898, so many people talked about, oh, this is the first time. Again, indicating how so little of this history is known. And so I think if nothing else, we were deeply distressed to see what happened on January 6th, but were, I guess, pleased that more people were learning this history that continues to repeat itself. And as I said before, will continue to repeat itself as long as we don't have meaningful truth and reconciliation around American history and its current manifestations.
Well, already we're seeing an attempt to erase the history of January 6th. We're only several months past that because Republican lawmakers are refusing to support a commission to investigate what actually happened. So this seems to be part of the same movement that we have been talking about an active reactionary movement to suppress an examination of history and what it means. You know, in addition to January 6th, though, of course, I mean, this week we are seeing the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and the ongoing issue of racism and structural racism, particularly in the criminal justice system. And Reggie, as a civil rights attorney, what are your thoughts about how those issues are connected?
Again, they're deeply connected, and I think and they're, as again, I'm going to keep saying this, they're going to keep repeating myself, they're going to continue to happen unless we can have a meaningful reexamination of America's failure to really honor its values, what it likes to proclaim, what it likes to demand of other countries and nations. We're not living up to those ideals. And one of the things that I have been thinking of late, in the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder, was the extraordinary effort that was necessary in order to secure some modicum of justice for his family. You had people having to riot internationally during the pandemic. You had a teenage girl having to have captured this on film. Without those extraordinary events taking place, would there have been justice? As a lawyer, what I've said is the case wasn't closed. Our eyes did not deceive us. We saw what we saw. Yet, because we know how the justice system works in America, we were on pins and needles that the verdict might not be what it should have been. And so all of these things are connected in some way. It's about denying facts, denying history, preserving power at all costs, protecting white supremacy. And so I'm really happy that we are having more of these conversations, and I hope that they continue because they really need to.
Well, just in the last moment that we have, I mean, you both took it upon yourselves to educate not just yourselves, but the broader community in Wilmington through book club, through art, through your activism. So what would you say to people about the need to educate ourselves on what happened in Wilmington, what happened in Greenwood, Oklahoma, and Tulsa, and the many other injustices that have been happening, that this is something that communities, individuals, but really communities need to take on board? Greg, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's... I keep going back to this idea of truth and moral obligation, that there is a moral obligation to know the actuality of what happened. And I think for me, it's been about understanding my childhood and my teenage years better, and understanding what the South meant and how it can be better and how it can be more how it can be more equal in actuality, not in principle. So I mean, and also I'm a professor too, and this has been really driving in terms of how it's affected my curriculum. And I teach at art schools and universities in the Northeast, and I think it's really important that these kind of histories influence the way we look at culture, the way we look at art. And I think I'm very optimistic that there's been some paradigm shifts in institutional levels that will be hopefully lasting.
Well, Greg and Reggie, it's been a real honor to have you both on the show today. We encourage our viewers to watch Wilmington on Fire, having its Free Speech TV broadcast premiere this week, and to really engage with all the content that we're bringing you around all of these issues. And next week on Just Solutions, we'll continue the conversation, this time taking a look at reparations. What would that look like? What would compensation look like? Not just for the descendants of those in Wilmington and Oklahoma, but for the Black community all around the country. That's next week. Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.